welcome Kate Kelly. Well, thank you very much. It's very nice to be back. It was a lot of fun for us to drive up to Larchmont. I'm accompanied by my two grown daughters here, Elizabeth Miller and Callie Schweitzer, and we did a tour through town, so it was a lot of fun to come back and be here and revisit and see what the town is like, and I'm glad to see familiar faces here. For those of you who kind of know a little bit about my backstory, we had been living in Larchmont for more than 20 years, and my husband is with CBS. They pretty much moved all of CBS management out to the West Coast, and so that necessitated our move to Los Angeles. And I am glad to be able to assure you that I am still from Larchmont. Because if you're smart in living in Los Angeles, you pinpoint your housing neighborhood based on your commute. So George pinpointed a particular area of town where I was to look for a house, and it just happened the house we fell in love with was in Larchmont, in that part of Los Angeles. So we are still living in Larchmont, and it's actually very reminiscent of the houses here. A lot of different varieties of architecture and very friendly people, and we miss kind of having that town center, but on by the same token, it's still been a wonderful place to be. When I was still living in Larchmont, New York, my main stock in trade was, other than my wonderful three daughters, was that I was a book writer. I did a lot of books as collaborations, and then books on my own as well. And I guess as the world was changing, one of the things I believed strongly in was my personal belief in the goodness of our country and the fact that the publishing world was moving to the web. So I decided the best thing to do was to move to the web with them and see what we could do with it. So I started a website called America Comes Alive at that time, and have been writing for, I guess, almost 5 years on little-known stories of America's past. And some of the most popular stories that I covered during that section have to do with American inventors, because people just seem to love the idea of the inventiveness that people come up with and the kind of problems that they're able to solve and how they go about solving those particular problems. So I decided to divide my talk into 3 different sections, and if we can change the slide, that would be great. The 3 sections this is the first section we're going to deal with, and it's the 3 inventions that are part of our everyday lives. But our second section, which we'll get to in a little bit, is inventions by women. And then the final section of inventions that we'll talk about are inventions where I just think there's a really interesting backstory, and I think you'll get a kick out of hearing the stories. But we're going to start out by talking about the cell phone, because all of us in this room are of an age where we can actually remember that the cell phone has transformed our lives. That there was a day when you actually had to show up on a street corner at exactly the time you said, because you had no way to contact a person who was en route to that corner. Today we have these handheld devices. We're constantly phoning, texting, doing whatever we need to let people know exactly where we are, and we're in touch with people at all times. So to tell you a little bit about how we had got to the fact that we have these devices, we need to go back a bit. And again, those of you who watch old television or old movies know that there was actually a type of a car telephone that existed in as early as the 1940s. Those weren't really cell phones. Those were radio phones. They were of very limited use because they were only 3 channels that were able to make and receive calls. They were primarily used in emergency vehicles. A few wealthy families would have these types of car phones. But one of the big issues was that these car phones weighed 80 pounds. So they certainly weren't anything that were going to fit into your pocket or even into our handbags. That would have been a little bit much. So we were still very much in search of the cell telephone that would have been more mobile. And in the 1970s, we have 2 different laboratories who are working neck and neck in coming up with what they thought would be a portable phone that people could take with them. The laboratories were Bell Laboratories and Motorola Laboratories. Well, Martin Cooper at Motorola thinks he is getting very close to his solution. So one day in late March of 1973, he really feels like his phone has gone through every test it needs to. So he takes his device, goes down to the streets, and where is his laboratory but in the center of Manhattan, so he goes down to where else but the streets of Manhattan to make the first telephone call. He dials the number, and the person he calls is his competitor at Bell Labs. Well, that inventor probably wasn't so happy to hear from Martin with his phone call, because Martin tells him where he is calling from, what kind of device he is calling on, and exactly what's going on. So Bell Labs was a little bit concerned about that. But Motorola was quite excited, and they scheduled a press conference right away. April 3rd, 1973, New York Hilton Hotel. They invite all the members of the press to come and understand and see this miraculous telephone. Martin Cooper is running the press conference, and he begins by dialing the number because he wants to demonstrate exactly how the phone works. And the only thing is, Martin is nervous, and he misdials the number. And we have all this documented in a first-hand report from the reporter from the New York Times. He misdials the number and calls the wrong person. But he is fortunately a man with a sense of humor. He covers what he has done with a joke, and he says, well, even this amazing device can't save you from a misdialed number. So he redials, makes his phone call, and then over the course of the press conference, all the reporters who have come are able to go up, use the telephone to call back to their editors in their newsrooms and prove that this device is exactly working as it was said to be. Now, Motorola at this time announces that they expect that they will get FCC approval by about 1976 for there to be a publicly available cell phone. The government did begin using cell phones more quickly than the public did, but the actual approval for this kind of device did not come through till 1983. So those of you who may have had very early cell phones will know that we certainly were not sitting in the 1970s with any sort of cell phone at that time. So everything worked out very well for Martin, and we can go forward on a couple of the photographs. Oh, no, that's not, okay, not quite. Okay, we're going to stick, yeah, there we go. We see that Martin Cooper is still alive. He frequently is interviewed. The cell phone recently just had its 41st anniversary. And I don't want you to spend one single moment worrying about Bell Labs, not that you would anyway, but Bell Labs did become first in the invention of the cell towers. And again, we all remember making those telephone calls and calling someone from the highway where you would be driving from cell zone to cell zone, and the call would drop. So eventually, I mean, I think right now most of us drive in areas where that system works quite well, and Bell is the one who made it possible. So we owe a debt of gratitude to both of these different laboratories, because certainly we have all benefited from having these phones. Now, the next thing we are going to go to is something else that actually is on our phone, and that is the keyboard. Okay, so here we are in 2014 with these amazing pocket devices where we can call any place in the world. And yet, if you look at your cell phone, we are dealing with the same QWERTY keyboard that has been around since 1867. That was when that keyboard was first conceived. So what are we doing in 2014 still dealing with a keyboard that was originated so very long ago? Well, the story begins with the invention of the typewriter. And the typewriter, the manual typewriter, was invented as a writing machine. The people behind it were newspaper editors who wanted a more rapid way of delivering their stories. They were, in the 1860s, they were working out some sort of a system. They started out with a keyboard lineup that was alphabetical, because that certainly made sense. But then they discovered, and any of you, and I'm sure a lot of you who have used manual typewriters, know that if you use the typewriter in such a way that you hit the keys unevenly, or you hit two keys close together, what happens is the keys stick together. So there goes the rhythm of your typing. You have to stop, you have to unstick the keys, and then you got to go back to wherever you were figuring out your typing. So over the course of working on the keyboard, one of the things that they came up with was the placement of this particular layout was the ideal placement to keep the keys from striking each other with the most common typing of the words. But that also put E, which is the most commonly used letter, not on the home keys, which is not such a practical idea. And the second most commonly used letter is the A, and that is under our very weakest finger. So again, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense in this day and age for that kind of a keyboard. Nonetheless, it is still with us. We get to the 1940s, and a guy named August Dvorak has decided there really has to be a better system. So he came up with what he called the Dvorak typing method. He reconfigured all of the keys on the keyboard so that you could, in this particular layout of a keyboard, you can type 100 common words from the home keys. Dvorak came up with a method that you could type 400 common words from the home keys. So he was urging that the world convert to this system. Well, even in the 1940s, they had consulting companies. A consulting company was called in, and they studied what it would cost to retrain all the current typists from the QWERTY keyboard to the Dvorak method, and they determined that it would be more costly to try to retrain typists than it would be to simply continue on into infinity with the QWERTY keyboard. So I don't know when they'll ever come up with a different system, and now actually the way people type and the way we all peck through our phones, it may not make any difference. But when you do next use your keyboard on your cell phone, do think about the fact that your 2014 device is actually using something that dates back to the early 1870s, which is fairly amazing. Now, in the theme of things we run into every day, if you'll switch to the next slide, I'm going to flip to a topic of blue jeans. Now, I know not everybody encounters blue jeans every single day, but I think most days of the week we tend to get home from the office and put on a comfortable pair of pants, and that is very likely to be our blue jeans. Most of us are also of an age where we remember the fact that we didn't call our blue jeans, we called them Levi's. They were our Levi's, and we would discuss with our friends which pair of Levi's were you going to wear. Now, from this kind of usage of the name, one would expect that the inventor of the jeans was Levi Strauss, the name associated with the blue jeans. And so that understanding sort of went forward, and nobody bothered to think about whether anybody else was involved, until an archivist in Washington, D.C. was going through some court records from Nevada and came across a court case from Nevada, and the date of the court case was the 1873. And she's reading the court case, and all of a sudden she is reading a totally different story about the invention of blue jeans. And if you'll move forward one more, we'll see the next fellow. She's reading, like any good idea, a good idea needs to often be defended from its competitors in court. And so what she is reading is this court case. Being interviewed on the stand is a fellow named Jacob Davis, who's a tailor, and he is telling about how the first pair of blue jeans actually came to be made, because he made them. And the story went like this. Jacob Davis was an immigrant to the country. He had come into the country, had participated in the gold rush, not too successfully, ran a beer hall, not too successfully, tried another business, that didn't work out, and finally thought, well, he better go back to his old trade, tailoring. So he opened a tailoring shop and discovered business was good. You know, all these people coming out to settle in the West or work in the gold mines needed work clothes. So he became a very well-respected fellow in his community making different work clothes. One day he was approached by a woman who said, Mr. Davis, I need you to make a really durable pair of work pants for my husband. He just wears through everything. You know, he puts his tools in his pocket and the pockets wear off and the pants wear out, and we need a pair of pants that will really last. So Jacob says, well, fine. But it turns out the husband doesn't have time to come in for measurements. And in those days, they didn't actually have sizes. So he gives the woman a string, explains to her how to measure her husband so that they can come up with the right measurements for exactly how the pants should be made. She goes off, measures her husband, comes back with the string with all the appropriate measurements. They negotiate a price. They agree on the fact that it will be $3 paid in advance, and Jacob gets to work on making the pants. His decision on the kind of fabric to use was going to be this dark denim. Dark color was good because it would not show the dirt. Denim was good because it was a very sturdy fabric. And he purchased it from his merchant in San Francisco who ran a dry goods company, Levi Strauss. So he buys the fabric, creates the pants, and he's thinking about what the woman has said about it being really durable. And he's looking around his workroom and he notices the grommets that he uses he also did horse harnesses, and the grommets would be used to fasten the pieces of leather together. So he thought, well, if she really needs something sturdy, maybe the answer to the pockets is to put grommets at the bottom of the pocket, and he also put a grommet at the bottom of the fly. The woman comes in, picks up the pants. Her husband wears them for a good long time. The woman is thrilled, the husband is thrilled, and word gets around about Jacob Davis's pants. Within 18 months, he's got a backlog of, he's making 200 pairs of jeans. Business is really good. Now, Jacob Davis was an immigrant. He was not that comfortable in the English language, not that comfortable writing English. And yet he was a smart businessman, and he knew that it would be very important that he file a patent for what he'd done because someone would copy it. We'll never know exactly what went wrong with the patent, but whatever happened, he put in his paperwork for the patent and he was rejected. And he's sitting there thinking, wow, I have come up with this incredible invention. I've got too much work to do. I really don't have time to go through this process again. So he thinks about the people he works with, and he thinks of Levi Strauss, who's more sophisticated and a better businessman than he is in terms of the language and that sort of thing. So he contacted Levi Strauss, and actually the letter he wrote is available online. And the letter to Strauss is very direct, saying, if you will pay the $68 patent fee and apply for the patent for me, I will give you a cut of the rights for pant sales within the Nevada, California area. It was very clear that Jacob Davis meant to keep the patent on anything sold outside the area for himself. Now, we don't know what happened between then and when everything actually transpired, because certainly the idea that we all called them Levi's was not happenstance. I mean, something must have happened, and maybe there was some sort of verbal negotiation that changed. But what with one thing and another, Levi Strauss did successfully file the patent for Jacob Davis. Jacob Davis moved to San Francisco to run a factory that was funded by Levi Strauss, where they made blue jeans, ended up making work shirts, and they went into all sorts of different kind of work. Jacob Davis supervised that plant, and then when he retired, his son took over. So Levi Strauss and Jacob Davis certainly were a partnership for a long time, but over time the pants became known as Levi's, and Jacob Davis's story became mostly forgotten until this archivist comes along. Now, we all know that the Levi Strauss Company continues to exist and is doing just fine. You'll also be glad to know that so does the Jacob Davis family. They continued to make a line of work clothes. It's called the Ben Davis Company, and they make the King Kong of work clothes. But Levi Strauss has also continued to be a believer in what they have done with the jeans. And one of the campaigns they have run has been a Send Them Home campaign. And I suppose this came from, I think it was the 1970s when everybody kind of got into the idea of wearing worn out, hard-worn jeans with tears in them and that sort of thing. So it occurred to the Levi company that it would be smart to find whatever old jeans were out there, because maybe they could be resold or reused in some way. So they started this Send Them Home campaign. And the Send Them Home campaign was, if you find an old pair of blue jeans, submit them and we will be recognizing in some way the oldest pair of jeans that we find. According to the records that I was able to find, the oldest pair that they have had submitted to them thus far came from 1879 and were valued at more than $150,000. Oh, wow. And the way that people found these pants would be, they became, you know, in their hobbyists, they became denim hunters and would go into old mine shafts and that sort of thing looking for those types of work clothes. So it really became quite a hobby. I don't know if they still are running that, but either way, it was quite a story to think about, $150,000 pair of blue jeans. If we can go to the next slide then. These give you some of the examples, and well, we've got a couple of more of the Levi Strauss label. And I have one more, at least this one shows you the grommets that they used for the strength. And a following one. The important thing here was that at the time that they were doing the grommets on the pants, they also realized, now you actually see on this newer pair, they're just using heavier stitching instead of the grommets, but they also realized it was important to have a trademark, and so Jacob Davis had come up with the double arch. And they always have used this on the back of every pair of pants that they've done, so when you see your teenage daughters wearing all the fancy designer jeans and that sort of thing, and they have that some sort of pocket mark, you'll know that it was started by then. But one of the things they ran into was that during World War II, thread was rationed so tightly that they couldn't afford to have the thread, the extra thread, to make the trademark. So even during that time, they continued with the trademark and they painted it on the back of the jeans. So that was a very important part of it. So with that, we will say goodbye to the Levi family and move on to, oh no, we're not. This is the oldest pair thus far. There they are.
That's a big pair.
And we certainly hope they were in a mine shaft, because otherwise I don't know who was wearing them. So with that, we will move forward to the inventions by women. The convertible bed, and I think from this the list, we're going to talk about the convertible bed, the windshield wiper, dishwasher, and the disposable diaper, all of which are very important things for us. But if we can flip to the next slide, that would be great. This invention is one of the most sought, it's one of the inventions that is most looked for on my website of any of them, because it was invented by the first African-American woman who ever held a patent, Sarah Good. And clearly she's on some school list where they have lists of inventors, and she's there, because I have so many school kids who are looking to do their paper on Sarah Good. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of information about her. We think she was born in about 1850. She was a slave. She was freed after the Civil War, moved to Chicago, and married a furniture maker. It was her job to run the store. Her husband made the furniture that she was able to sell, but they were in the middle of Chicago. So one of the things she was hearing from her customers was the fact that people were very tight on space, just like anybody who lives in a New York City apartment. Tight space, difficult to deal with. So she started thinking about the fact that what would answer that would be some sort of piece of furniture that could have a double use. So in her case, the thing that she patented and came up with a design for was something that was a roll-top desk by day, but could unfold into a bed for sleeping at night. And it was a very good seller, and she did indeed get the patent in 1885 for that device. So when you really think about it, I mean, she created the forerunner of the Murphy bed and the Hideaway bed, and really a lot of things, and she deserves a lot of credit for having come up with a creative solution on that. Now, if we'll go to the next slide, and we will meet Mary Anderson. Now, the thing that it makes me smile about Mary Anderson is the fact that she invented the windshield wiper. And when you think about it, whoever thought you had to invent a windshield wiper? Didn't cars just always have windshield wipers? And the answer is no, they didn't. But then the best part about Mary is she also wasn't a driver. She was simply a passenger. She was from Birmingham, Alabama. The year was 1902. She came up to New York City in the winter, and her main method of getting around the city was by streetcar. Must have been a snowy winter. It was probably a winter just like this past winter. And she was riding the streetcar a lot, and she discovered that the solution for getting rid of snow for the streetcar driver was one of two options. If he was in a really old streetcar, what he had to do was stop the streetcar, excuse me, get out of his streetcar and go around to the front of the vehicle and use his arm to wipe away the snow. So that caused a stop, it caused a delay, and it certainly wasn't very much fun for the streetcar driver. If she was on a slightly more modern streetcar, they had a new invention. And the new invention was a windshield that tipped. And the theory was that it would tip and the snow was supposed to go off the streetcar onto the street. But it sounds like what often happened was a lot of the snow dumped onto the streetcar driver's lap. And certainly the people riding in the streetcar, when the thing tipped, got this huge blast of cold air. So Mary Anderson was really baffled by that. Like, wow, that is such an annoying system. So she goes back to Birmingham, Alabama, and is possessed by the idea that there's got to be something better to do about that. And if we can do the next slide, that would be great. She comes up with the design for the windshield wiper. And this is 1903. She receives the patent, and her idea has to do with a weighted arm, and she knows it needs to be weighted so that it will be held up against the glass. And so she has the patent, and she starts approaching manufacturers to convince them to buy this from her so that she can, make some money from the deal. She is totally unsuccessful at making a sale. And the argument against it was, well, that would be so distracting for the driver. Now, forget the idea that if he's driving with a mountain of snow in front of him, that might be distracting. But I actually personally feel that had it been a man going around trying to sell a windshield wiper, he probably would have been successful. As it happened, by 1916, a windshield wiper was standard issue on every vehicle that was made, so they certainly came into being, but unfortunately Mary Anderson did not profit from it. And we're ready for the next slide, which is the dishwasher. Now, men actually came up with the first concept and the early patents on dishwashers. In the 1850s, there were 2 different patents that were filed for dishwashers, but they didn't work very well. And we are not talking about a woman who was tired of washing her own dishes. We are talking about a socialite who invents the first dishwasher. She was very annoyed with her help because she had this fine china and they were washing the dishes by hand and they were chipping the dishes. So this motivates her to the idea that she had better come up with some device that would work better. So she comes up with basically a forerunner of what we have today, which had to do with a bottom machine. The dishes go into a rack, and then she came up with a more powerful system than the men had come up with of steam and water coming up to wash the dishes. And so she was able to get a patent for it in 1886. She introduces it at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. The device sells to a few wealthy families who see it and to some restaurants. But it really took until the early 1950s before we had perfected the technology to make things small enough and cheap enough that it could actually become a standard part of the American home. So thank goodness none of us were living back then, because dishwashers are actually a really nice thing. And we're ready for Marion. Oh, this is an ad for the dishwasher, and now we're ready for Marion Donovan. Okay, Marion Donovan was the person we owe for disposable diapers. And I know disposable diapers are probably not green, and parents today are probably supposed to do it very differently. But my goodness, for all of those who did our child rearing when we did, it was really nice to have disposable diapers. Marion Donovan was born into a family where her father was an inventor. He had invented a lathe and had a manufacturing plant where he made the lathes. So she had witnessed the idea that if you see a problem, you can solve the problem and then have a financial success by manufacturing it. When she was 7 years old, her mother died. So her best option after school was to stop by the factory, and she ended up staying with her father at the place of business a lot of the time. So certainly she was accustomed to the idea of working and toying around with things and that sort of thing. And so that was very much a part of her background. She goes ahead and grows up and finishes college and moves to New York City and is an assistant editor at Vogue magazine. So she's headed away from the lathe business for sure. But she marries and becomes a housewife in Westport. But again, she's still got this inventor's spirit about her, and she is putting her kids down for naps regularly. And at this point, she's using cloth diapers, and every time she wakes them, or every time they wake up, she is discovering that they have soaked through their diaper, they have soaked through their clothing, and often they have soaked through their crib sheets. So this is just like not a fun aspect of parenting. So she comes up with the concept of maybe a diaper cover would work. So one night she takes down the shower curtain in her household, and I don't know what her husband thought about that, but hopefully he thought that was okay. She takes down the shower curtain and starts seeing what she can do to fabricate a diaper cover. She comes up with something, uses it on her own kids for a little while, and the only thing about the plastic of the shower curtain was it held so much moisture in that the child was even more prone than they are anyway to have diaper rash. So she continues her experimentation and finds the parachute fabric works. It has just enough breathability that if you use that as the fabric, that it actually was a much more successful diaper cover. She patents that, she finds someone to manufacture it, and her first store, and I'm sorry, I have a Bloomingdale's representative in my family, but she will love this aspect of the store. Marion Donovan's first sale was to Saks Fifth Avenue, and that's where they ended up selling the diaper cover, and it was sold very successfully. And she even had a letter from the president of Saks Fifth Avenue saying how very unusual it was to have a new product come in and then simply blow out of the store. But of course, I think all of us are sort of like, Saks Fifth Avenue? Diaper cover? I mean, today's image of the store has nothing to do with diaper covers. So it's sort of a funny thought to think about how these departments...
What year was that?
Oh, this was the 1950s with the diaper cover. But Marion Donovan continues on from there, and she keeps thinking, well, there still has to be a better way because I'm still going through all these cloth diapers and I still have to do all this laundry. What else could I do? So she starts experimenting with the idea of the disposable diaper, and she experiments with different kinds of paper, and of course, just like we are always reading in the ads about our athletic clothes today, you need something that wicks the moisture away from the body, and so she's looking for the type of paper that will help wick the moisture away from the baby. She comes up with something that will work, and her job now is to go around to see if she can't find a manufacturer. She goes around for several years, and you know, all the men who are running manufacturing companies are saying, there's no need for that. You know, this is something we don't need. But she finally comes up with to the Victor Mills Company. And they say, you know, I think you're on to something. And we can move to the next slide with that one. And Pampers is the company that resulted. So from 1961 forward, we were thankful to have these disposable diapers. So again, now Marion Donovan went on to do 18 other patents. I mean, she definitely did have inventing in her blood and was very successful at what she did, but these are the things that she would have been most strongly known for. Now we're going to move to the next section, and we're going to talk about two inventions with surprising stories. And I guess the reason that who invented the can opener is always a question that can come up. But what's interesting about that question is before you have the can opener, you have to have the can. So I usually stick with my stories, and we can move to the next slide. I usually stay with my stories with American inventors. But in this case, we actually have to go back to Napoleon, because before Napoleon, there were no cans. And he was the one who actually inspired the idea that somebody had to come up with some invention like the can. He didn't know it was going to be the can. But what he did was he put money on the table and said, I need a way for my troops to be fed. And there is no way to travel with enough food that stays fresh so that they can be fighting the wars that I need them to be fighting and have enough food with them in order to keep them well enough fed. So I will give a reward to anyone who can come up with a system that will work. Well, the reward money is out there for 15 years before anybody comes up with anything. Because of course the science was unknown, Louis Pasteur had not yet come up with pasteurization. I mean, there was still very little known about what could be done. But 15 years into all of this process, we have a fellow who comes up with a system that works. He's a French candy manufacturer, and he figures out that if you put fresh food into a clean jar and heat that jar to a very high temperature, you sterilize everything to a good enough degree that the food will stay fresh for a period of time and you can travel with it. Now, the only problem with that for Napoleon's army was traveling with a bunch of jars of food. I mean, this is probably not going to work. So we need to go forward a few more years until someone comes up with the concept that you could take a can and do the same thing with the heating process. And again, they still hadn't a clue what the science was. They were just finding out that it worked. But the kind of material they were working with to make the can was iron. So they were making these very thick, very heavy cans, not the tin cans we use today. So it worked. These cans would go along with the troops, and the opening devices they would carry with them were hammer and chisel. Now, there is no information on how clean that chisel was when they were hammering into the food or any sort of story like that, but that was the way that you had to get into the can at that time. But that does finally bring us to America, because the first good can openers, and this is a representative. I was not able to get a photograph or even a sketch of what they call the bayonet and sickle style can opener, but it basically was something that it sounds like the very early version. The weakness of it was the fact that depending on the size of the can, you had to adjust it and you had to get the cutter blade going around the right edge, so it didn't sound at all easy to work with. But on the other hand, you were way ahead because you weren't dealing with a hammer and a chisel. So that part of it was a really good thing. And then after the bayonet and sickle was invented, we had, right after that, the next thing actually, interestingly, was the wind-off can. We still see those with sardine cans today. And that was the second invention that came along, but as you know, that's very limited use at this point. In 1870, and we move forward, we have a guy who came up with a device like this that worked a little bit better. And then one more slide takes us to the rotary can opener, and that came in 1925. And the key to that was that it actually had two different wheels, so that one wheel could go around inside the can and the other wheel could go around outside, and they could cut in sequence. Shortly after that, 1931, someone thinks of the electric can opener. Definitely a good idea. And the Papa open can opener came, the Pop type came in 1959. So definitely we were making a lot of progress, just not too quickly early on. So now we move to our final story, and that is the drunkometer. I think that I began thinking about this particular topic because as all the publicity was going around about would Washington State and Colorado legalize marijuana, I kept thinking, I wonder what the police will do about identifying whether someone is driving high. So I thought, well, if I'm going to ask that question, I guess I better ask, what were they doing with early alcohol consumption on the road? So I started looking into the history of that. The first drunk driving driving laws went onto the books in 1910 in New York State, and I don't know why particularly, but maybe it was just bigger population and more cars at that time. Then there are not too many more laws that follow because, of course, we have Prohibition in 1920. And yet during that time, of course, there was a lot of, here in Larchmont, we know about a lot of places where there was speakeasy type of drinking and that sort of thing. So certainly people were still drinking, so it was still a problem, and I'm sure that the police were still aware of it. But it was not as big a societal problem as it was going to come to be. So over the course of time, there was interest in coming up with some way of trying to register what the alcohol content was that made someone drunk and how to determine whether they were too drunk to drive. Now, I have no idea, but Indiana becomes the home state of inventing anything having to do with drunk driving. I have no theory on that. But a fellow by the name of Dr. Rolla N. Harger, who was a biochemistry professor at Indiana University Medical School, was the first one to devise any kind of a workable system. And this was in 1931. Of course, Prohibition was still in effect. And he took it as a hobby, that his device actually fit into a suitcase, and so he took it as a hobby that he would do ride-alongs with the police. I was going to say police cruiser, but I don't think they had cruisers in 1931. But he would ride along with them, and then if they suspected that someone was inebriated, they would stop them and they would ask them to voluntarily participate in the testing, and they would promise that there would be no punishment as a result, but they were just trying to gauge what kind of a method would work, because they needed to register in relation to what their testing did versus what the blood content was, and so it wasn't an easy process for them to come with everything that was matching. You might ask what their other measurements were. Of course, they did everything normal police would do. If they were driving in a weaving manner, if they get out and were slurring their language, if they were showing evidence of drinking at that time, that was enough to probably get you a ticket. Whether or not it would hold up in court, I'm not sure in that day. But in the meantime, they did know they had to come up with a better system. So Harger is working with this method, and if you'll flip to another thing, the way it worked was that the person would would blow into a balloon, and then the air that they blew into the balloon was passed through some sort of a potassium acid, I've got the thing down here, but it was some sort of a chemical combination. And if that liquid combination changed color to a certain level of a degree, they were judged too drunk to drive. But it took a long time to refine exactly what that test was. The test was also better if they were able to do it back at the police station. So you can imagine the discussion with the potentially drunk driver about how, gee, sir, it would really be nice if you would cooperate with us and come back to the police station. So I don't know how that all went out. So in continuing my research, though, I did want to find out who was the first person who ever got stopped for this offense. The people who were first stopped, we're still in Indiana. Roy and Neva Gordon were stopped by the Indiana police in August of 1937. Now, it actually sounded like a really bad accident. It was a two-lane road. The Gordons were behind a vehicle that they felt was moving too slowly. They move out into the other lane, figuring that they will pass, and then, of course, they did not realize that another car was coming head-on, so they're moving forward. They are hit head-on by the other car who's in his rightful lane, which bumps their car into the car they were passing. You have a three-car stack up, and my understanding is there was no report that anyone died, so we'll hope not, but they did identify that the Gordons were probably the people at fault. They underwent the alcohol testing using this method, and often what the police would discover is as the liquid began to change colors, the people would become very nervous, and it would be like truth serum, where it would be like, oh yes, I actually was drinking, don't arrest me. But the Gordons were a little bit more savvy than that, and they did not come forward with any sort of confession, and they got taken to court. They hire an attorney. Their court session is scheduled for an afternoon session. The attorney is fairly convinced that what he wants to do is get this type of testing thrown out as something that should not be used. So he says, you know, I don't believe in this kind of testing, and I am perfectly willing to be tested this afternoon for this kind of thing and see how this thing works. So he goes through the testing, and the color of the liquid changes a little bit, but not all that much. And he says, well, see, this proves nothing. I had 3 shots of cognac and a beer for lunch. And only after these 4 drinks, I guess, did he realize, oh, where the Gordons changed to a very dark color, I wonder how much liquid they must have consumed. So clearly he had sunk the ship of his clients. But don't worry, the Gordons did not have to pay a penalty, because the police report, with all the confusion of the 3 cars and the testing and everything, they had forgotten to write down which of the Gordons was driving. So everybody got off scot-free. And of course, the drunkometer did get adopted, and more states did end up acquiring the device, and it was used for a while. But we stay right there in Indiana until a member of the Indiana police actually comes up with the breathalyzer in 1954, which is basically a device that they still use today. So at last we finally had a better system, and I still have yet to do the story on how Colorado and Washington are handling the circumstance with the driving high, but I do think that will be an interesting story for another day. But I guess the takeaway, you know, when I come to a place like Larchmont, New York, I know you all don't need inspiration. You are already people who have done inspiring things, and you have already lived these lives doing so much and being inspired. But I guess that life's problem today is we all have so many options and so many things going on in our lives. The important thing to remember and take away from this speech is the idea that in every case, what these people did was isolate one single problem. They set aside everything else that was going on in their lives, and they said, I am going to solve this issue, like Mary Anderson and her windshield wiper. So she goes back and she works very hard on one single problem. So every time you get overwhelmed by things, I hope you will remember my stories of my inventors and think about the fact that, well, what I really need to do is just isolate that one problem, and some sort of clarity will come to me. In the meantime, it's delightful to be back. I really feel like I ought to pull up a chair, and you all ought to be able to give me a report on everything that's been going on with the monument and Engine 1 and all the different things that you all have had going on here, because I have missed it. I've missed the house tours, all the house histories we have done together, and so I am very happy to be back. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. If you would like to sign up for my newsletter, I have, all I need is a name and an email, and I would be happy to add you, and it's a free monthly newsletter that comes out, and it's a lot of fun. So if people would like to sign up for that, I will pass that back, just like I said I told you to. So does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
A couple of comments. One, on a recent trip to Europe, we found that the keyboards in use on their computers are not QWERTY.
Oh, they aren't.
They're a little different. I mean, they're pretty much QWERTY, but not quite. And
Not
it's
quite
very
QWERTY.
confusing to type because I kept making mistakes.
Oh, that's actually very interesting. I would love to, I'll have to look that up and see what they've decided to change. Because certainly today, I think it's so rare for people to learn the touch typing method. They probably do actually have a lot of freedom in terms of changing a keyboard, because, I mean, we were all taught touch typing, but I bet that you all never learned touch typing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you did? Okay, so it really was,
Second comment.
everybody's doing the thumb method. Yes.
Second comment. When I was younger, before World War II, we didn't call them jeans, the Levi's. We called them dungarees.
Oh, yes, that's true, that's
We were under the
true.
impression that they were used by Indian sailors, which is what's an Indian name, that it's from India.
Okay,
Well, where the denim came from in the first place.
and I don't know that answer, But yeah, that is, okay, and yes, that is interesting. There was probably an interim time, and maybe the Levi company faded for a little while, and then there was a resurgence in them as a style conscious
Yeah.
thing when we all got back into denims, because there was a period of time when nobody wore blue jeans, and then moved into it.
Third comment,
Oh, yes.
forgive me, I'm old.
Oh, that's okay, we love it.
Margaret's father, just after World War II in France, as a method of surviving, started making diaper covers out of parachute material, 1945.
You know, parachute material was the only thing that was really widely available because of all the soldiers and so on.
Yeah.
So,
Did he come back to the United States?
yeah, but he never made that
He
here.
never made it.
Oh, he didn't make it here, so he probably didn't patent it.
No.
Okay, well, I wonder if she read about what he had done.
I don't
It is
know.
very interesting. It's very possible. That's interesting. So, because certainly the idea that she came up with the idea of
Wow, it's
parachute fabric was sort of out of the blue and not necessarily part of her
It's a
background.
very useful thing.
Well, that's a good connection to make. Wonderful.
You should write about that.
Hi, Susan.
We didn't know that.
So back to Mr. Levi Strauss for a moment. What do you think he was selling the denim for? If he carried it, and Mr. Davis was the one who came up with the idea to make pants out of it?
His family had come over and had set up a dry goods store in New York, and he came over later and decided that with everyone moving west, that he should take a branch of the store and move it to San Francisco. And so he was selling all kinds of dry goods, but he carried a kind of duck cloth that was also used for all sorts of things. And they were making things like tents and, kind of anything that you might, blankets, anything you might need for heading out to the gold mines or any kind of ranching or anything. So there were many different types of things, that they were using. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Yes.
How often do you come east?
Right now I have a vested interest in coming to New York because I have 2 daughters in the city. And George's department is half in the city and half in Los Angeles, so we go back and forth about every 6 weeks or so. This winter, it just didn't work out to come back very often. But that actually had multiple reasons. But we did not mind not being here for the snow. So anyway, we are back pretty often actually, and it's wonderful to come back, but Los Angeles has also been just a wonderful home too.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much, and